Summarizing the past can be done in a couple of ways, and I have selected three. One by looking at the theoretical perspectives available in the broader area of development and social change. Secondly, by looking at the role communication can play in this area. And thirdly, by having a look at what was hot topics, what were the hot topics in different periodical historical periods. So, without going into detail, as I said, in my own work I summarize the perspectives on development in a threefold way. As we all probably know, there was the traditional perspective, which is called modernization and growth, which is still very much alive and kicking in the real world, but in the academic environments it has lost its cause and it is no longer considered to be a theoretically viable kind of option. In the 70s or late 60s and 70s, we were seeing the emergence of a new way of looking at development issues, and that was a perspective offered from the so-called third world, mainly in those days Latin America, but it has gradually also translated into perspectives and experiences in other parts of the world. And lastly, the one which is being debated since the, let's say, the mid-70s, early 80s, is, and I summarize it under the term multiplicity, but you'll find it in other kind of configurations and terminologies in the literature, is a perspective which emphasizes much more issues like cultural identity, multidimensionality, another kind of development, another approach, another understanding of development. So development should no longer be, or not only be looked at as an economic kind of process. In communication, we have distinguished different perspectives, but I would like to group them under two broad areas, and one being a more top-down perspective, which comes in different titles and concepts. The two-step flow is being referred to in certain parts of the literature, extension approaches, the diffusion of innovations. All these strategies and perspectives are still very much offered, and I'm sure that some of you who are taking these courses are expected to read and study these. There is a second and a more alternative kind of perspective which has gained some headway, and that's in my own writing summarized under the concept of participatory model. It starts at the other end of the spectrum. It was one of the outcomes of what was debated in the communication science, the cultural studies perspective, the emphasis on the consumer, the audience rather than the producer, the communicator. And that perspective, once again, has different kind of implications and backgrounds. Now, we see, if we look at the literature and research done in different areas, that in the first period, period studied, and I refer to work done by others, 1958, 1986, the so-called modernization perspective was also very prominent, available in the literature, in the research being done. It examined the relevance of media content and messages. It was, of course, looking at comparative ways of analyzing, and it had a major interest in policy research and recommending certain trajectories, certain ways of handling not only communication in theory, but also in applied ways. In the second period, 87-96, one sees a complete change of the research, and it's fair to say that in those days one turned the research upside down. One moved away from the traditional top-down perspectives on communication, and one started looking at more participatory attempts, community media, small-scale kind of communication exercises. In the last phase, which is again being documented, 97-2005, there is a re-emergence of the modernization perspective, but now it comes under the umbrella of technology issues. So you could say that technological determinism, which has always been part of the modernization perspective, is once again providing some arguments and some perspectives to researchers who study this, but the perspectives which are more alternative are still very much available as well. So what the future brings is of course to be seen, but I think that it's fair to say that we are still looking for a definite final answer to what development and communication is about. We are still very much doing both traditional as well as more innovative work, and the role of new technologies is definitely part of the future research. That brings me to my second part, mapping the future. I'll once again won't elaborate here, but I think that there are at least 5 concepts or elements worth mentioning. First of all, we have become more and more interdisciplinary. We are no longer economists studying economic development, political scientists studying political developments in societies, and any of the other sciences. We try to do that in an interdisciplinary way, and of course from our own original discipline perspective, but we cannot do without borrowing from other disciplines, and that also includes definitely when it comes to communication technologies, the computer science, the natural sciences, and all the sciences in other words.